60 seconds. 60 seconds that would shatter the progressive movement's carefully constructed narrative of unity and expose the civil war raging within the Democratic Party. When Vice President Kamala Harris, the woman who had broken glass ceilings, who had fought her way from California prosecutor to the second highest office in the land, who understood better than anyone what it took to win elections in purple America, looked directly at Zohran Mamdani and declared, "You're killing our party." It wasn't just political criticism. It was a death sentence delivered by the Democratic establishment to a radical who had forgotten that politics is about winning, not just being right. In that moment, every serious Democrat understood they were witnessing the party's immune system, finally rejecting the ideological infection that threatened its electoral survival. The confrontation had been inevitable since Mamdani's rise to national prominence. Behind closed doors at the White House, Harris's political team had been tracking his inflammatory statements with growing alarm. Internal polling showed that every time Mamdani made headlines with socialist rhetoric, Democratic candidates in swing states lost ground. The vice president, who had spent her career building coalitions and winning tough elections, understood something that academic progressives didn't. Good intentions without electoral victories were just expensive virtue signaling. Harris had been briefed extensively on what her advisors called the Mamdani problem. Focus groups in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin consistently showed that working-class Democrats viewed him as exactly the kind of elite radical who made them consider voting Republican. His promises of revolutionary change sounded to them like the rhetoric of someone who had never worked a blue-collar job or worried about losing health insurance. Most damaging of all, his attacks on moderate Democrats gave Republicans perfect campaign material for painting the entire party as extremist. The setting for their confrontation was supposed to be friendly territory. The annual Jefferson-Jackson Dinner in Iowa, the traditional gathering of Democratic activists and donors. Mamdani had been invited as the keynote speaker, a recognition of his rising star status among progressive activists. Harris was there to maintain party unity and help raise funds for upcoming elections. Neither expected the evening to become a defining moment in the struggle for the Democratic Party's soul. The dinner was held in the ornate ballroom of a Des Moines hotel, packed with the kind of Democratic faithful who donated money, knocked on doors, and showed up for every election. These were the people who kept the party functioning between presidential campaigns, teachers, union leaders, small business owners, and retirees who had voted Democrat for decades. They represented the coalition that actually elected Democrats to office as opposed to the social media activists who dominated progressive politics. Mamdani spoke first, delivering a familiar critique of American capitalism that played well with young progressives but increasingly alienated mainstream voters. He talked about dismantling systemic oppression, revolutionary economic transformation, and the need for Democrats to stop compromising with corporate fascists. The applause was polite but restrained. These were party loyalists who understood that winning elections required appealing to more than just the progressive base. Harris watched from the head table, her expression growing more serious as Mamdani's speech progressed. Her political instincts, honed by decades of campaigning in diverse California constituencies and later on the national stage, recognized exactly how toxic this message would be in competitive districts. Every attack on moderate Democrats, every promise of revolutionary change, every use of socialist buzzwords was ammunition for Republican attack ads. When Mamdani concluded to lukewarm applause, the MC invited Harris to offer brief remarks before the evening's fundraising appeal. What was supposed to be a routine party unity speech became instead the most devastating takedown in recent Democratic politics. Harris rose from her chair with the poise of someone who had prosecuted criminals, debated vice presidents, and navigated the highest levels of American politics. But there was something different in her demeanor, a sharpness that suggested this wouldn't be the usual diplomatic political rhetoric. "Thank you, Mayor Mamdani, for those remarks," Harris began, her voice carrying the prosecutorial edge that had made her famous during Senate hearings. "I think they perfectly illustrate a conversation we need to have as Democrats about the difference between activism and governance." The audience sensed immediately that something significant was happening. Harris wasn't offering the usual bland praise for party diversity. She was preparing to draw a line between acceptable Democratic politics and radical overreach. "I've spent my career fighting for progressive values," Harris continued, her tone becoming more pointed. "Criminal justice reform, climate action, economic equality, These aren't just talking points for me, they're the issues I've actually delivered results on. But here's what I've learned in 20 years of winning elections. You can't deliver results if you can't win elections. The criticism was subtle but unmistakable. Harris was distinguishing between progressives who actually achieved things and those who just talked about achieving things. Every time we alienate moderate voters with revolutionary rhetoric, we hand elections to Republicans, she said, her voice rising slightly. Every time we attack fellow Democrats for not being pure enough, we help conservatives who want to roll back everything we fought for. The audience was now fully engaged, recognizing that the vice president was offering a fundamental critique of the progressive approach that Mamdani represented. But it was Harris's next statement that would destroy Mamdani's credibility and define the future of Democratic politics. "Let me be very clear about something," she said, looking directly at Mamdani with the intensity of a prosecutor addressing a hostile witness. "When you promise voters revolutionary change that you can't deliver, when you attack Democrats who actually win elections, when you use rhetoric that scares away the working-class voters we need to protect democracy, you're not advancing progressive values. You're killing our party." The words, "killing our party," landed like a political nuclear bomb. Coming from the vice president, they carried institutional weight that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Harris had just declared that Mamdani's brand of progressivism wasn't just ineffective, it was actively destructive to Democratic electoral prospects. "I didn't fight my way to the vice presidency so that armchair revolutionaries could destroy everything we've built," she continued, her prosecutorial instincts fully engaged. "I didn't break barriers so that people who've never won a competitive election could lecture us about political strategy." The personal nature of the attack was devastating. Harris was using her own historic achievements to highlight Mamdani's lack of real political accomplishments outside safe Democratic strongholds. Then came the knockout blow that would be replayed across conservative media and Democratic strategy sessions for months. "You want to know the difference between us?" Harris asked, her voice taking on the cadence that had made her famous during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. "I've actually beaten Republicans. I've actually passed legislation. I've actually delivered results for working families. What have you done, except give Republicans talking points?" The silence that followed was deafening. Harris had just systematically demolished Mamdani's political credibility by focusing on the one thing that mattered most in politics: results. While he talked about revolution, she had actually changed laws. While he criticized the system, she had worked within it to deliver concrete benefits for voters. Mamdani's attempt at a response only made things worse. Rising from his chair with obvious discomfort, he tried to defend his approach by attacking Harris's record as a prosecutor and her willingness to work with moderate Democrats. "Madame Vice President," he began, his voice betraying his nervousness, "I think we have different definitions of progress. Some of us believe in fighting for transformational change rather than settling for incremental victories that leave systemic injustice intact." The criticism of Harris's prosecutorial background was a massive miscalculation. Attacking the first black woman, vice president, for being too tough on crime played directly into Republican narratives about progressive priorities. Harris's response was swift and lethal. "Incremental victories," she said, her voice dripping with incredulity. "I helped pass the largest climate investment in American history. I cast the tie-breaking vote for the Inflation Reduction Act. I've confirmed more diverse judges than any vice president in history. Those aren't incremental, those are transformational. And they happened because we won elections, not because we gave speeches about revolution." Each accomplishment she listed highlighted the contrast between her record of actual achievement and Mamdani's record of rhetorical excess. But she still wasn't finished dismantling his political identity. "You talk about systemic injustice," she continued, "but what system have you actually changed? You won an election in one of the safest Democratic districts in America and somehow think that qualifies you to lecture the rest of us about political strategy?" The destruction was complete. Harris had exposed Mamdani as someone whose radical credentials were built on theoretical purity rather than practical achievement, whose revolutionary rhetoric masked a fundamental lack of understanding about how change actually happens in American politics. The immediate reaction was electric. Conservative social media erupted with clips of Harris's takedown, with the "killing our party" soundbite becoming an instant viral sensation. Republicans celebrated seeing Democrats finally acknowledge what they had been arguing for years, that progressive extremism was destroying the party's electoral viability. But the real impact came from within Democratic circles. Moderate Democrats, who had felt pressured to stay silent about progressive overreach, suddenly had cover from the party's second-highest office holder. Campaign strategists in swing states began openly discussing the need to distance Democratic candidates from socialist rhetoric. Most significantly, donors who had been quietly concerned about the party's leftward drift began demanding changes in messaging and candidate recruitment. The media coverage was devastating for Mamdani's national ambitions. Headlines across the country highlighted the civil war within Democratic ranks. Harris slams progressive extremism. VP breaks with socialist wing. Democrats declare war on their own radicals. Even outlets sympathetic to progressive causes acknowledged that Harris had delivered a devastating critique that would be difficult to counter. Progressive activists tried to defend Mamdani by attacking Harris's record and questioning her commitment to transformational change. But their responses fell flat because Harris's achievements spoke for themselves. She had actually delivered the progressive victories that Mamdani could only promise, making his revolutionary rhetoric seem hollow by comparison. Most damaging was the reaction from Democratic voters themselves, particularly in the suburban and working-class communities that had swung the 2020 election. Focus groups conducted after the Harris-Mamdani exchange showed that voters appreciated the vice president's willingness to prioritize electoral success over ideological purity. Many expressed relief that party leadership was finally acknowledging the political damage caused by radical rhetoric. The long-term consequences for the Democratic Party were profound. Harris's critique provided a template for other moderate Democrats to push back against progressive demands without being labeled as sellouts or conservatives. Campaign consultants began incorporating her talking points about the difference between activism and governance into their standard messaging. For Mamdani personally, the encounter marked the effective end of his influence beyond progressive activist circles. His inability to effectively respond to Harris's critique had exposed him as someone who confused rhetorical skill with political competence. The mayor, who had once seemed destined for national leadership, suddenly appeared overmatched when facing scrutiny from experienced politicians who understood electoral realities. Perhaps most importantly, Harris had articulated what many Democrats felt but couldn't express, that good intentions without electoral victories were meaningless, that revolutionary rhetoric without practical results was just political masturbation, and that the party's survival depended on appealing to voters beyond the progressive base. 3 months after the Iowa confrontation, internal Democratic polling showed the lasting impact of Harris's intervention. Support for socialist-adjacent positions had declined among Democratic voters, while support for pragmatic progressive policies had increased. The Harris Doctrine, the principle that electoral success must take precedence over ideological purity, became the unofficial governing philosophy of the Democratic establishment. The 60-second destruction had accomplished something that years of private party discussions hadn't. It had given Democratic leaders permission to prioritize winning over ideological correctness. Harris had proven that you could defend progressive achievements while rejecting progressive extremism, that you could support transformational change while opposing revolutionary rhetoric. As one longtime Democratic strategist put it after the Iowa dinner, Kamala did what needed to be done. Someone had to tell these people that politics is about winning elections, not winning Twitter arguments. And thank God it was the vice president who said it, because now the whole party knows where leadership stands. The civil war within the Democratic Party had found its champion in an unlikely figure, a former prosecutor who understood that the best way to protect progressive values was to win elections, not wage ideological battles that drove away the voters needed for victory. In 60 seconds, she had reminded her party that revolution without power was just performance art, and that Mamdani's brand of politics was killing their chances of actually helping the people they claimed to represent.